All right. Welcome to another edition of the NRNRC Black Table Talk podcast. I am your host, Mr. Sellers, and we have a pretty exciting show for you guys today. All things supervision, and probation. So I'm going to give it over to my co-host, Mr. Ragone, to introduce yourself.
Hi. Yes, my name is Zachary Ragone. I'm the policy director here at the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens, and excited to be here today.
Yeah, so excited to have you as the co-host. And another guest that we have, special guest in the studio today, is none other than Miss Mary.
My name is Mary Zenger. I am a fellow at the DC Justice Lab. DC Justice Lab is a local DC-based policy organization working to make DC safer, freer, and more equal.
Absolutely. So today we're going to, like I said, talk about supervision and probation. And so hopefully you guys can tune in today and learn some things as we speak from the heart. I would like to kick it off with a little bit about, let's talk about the basics, right? So when you say supervision, what exactly does that cover, and what are the different types people may be experiencing as far as supervision? So I'll let it start there.
Yeah, like that's one of the interesting things is we hear community supervision and everybody kind of uses a bunch of different words, whether that's supervision, probation, parole. But like Mary, I know those are very different things legally speaking, right?
That's right. So I'm going to speak just from the DC perspective. But in DC, there are three types of community supervision. You might be on probation, which is something that's handed down at sentencing, which is a period of supervision as part of your sentence. But there's also supervised release. Supervised release follows any period of incarceration. When you are released, you have a period of community supervision, and that's determined by the law. It's based on the level of the severity level of the offense that you were convicted for. The last type is a little bit more rare, but we still have some people serving sentences on parole here in DC. We actually got rid of parole in DC in the early 2000s, but there are still people who were sentenced before that who are eligible to get parole, even though the parole system has been replaced by supervised release.
Yeah, and that's one of those things to where, and kind of what you're coming into the system through, whether that is, like you said, being given that right off the bat at sentencing, or if you've been in for a while, and are you kind of going for an early exit, which is more of that parole side of things, or just the normal termination of your sentence. It's one of those things. Each of them have a little bit of differences, but a lot of times in the general public, they all kind of get roped up in. You get out of prison on your normal term. They're like, oh, you're on parole, and it's a little bit different. But having a understanding of those differences kind of are important, because you've got kind of different things holding over your head. Like I know with parole, it becomes one of these things to where if you have some sort of violation or some kind of problem, you have your entire, whatever length of sentence you got to leave before, you have all that hanging over your head, whereas sometimes with supervision, it's more focused on whatever that term of supervision was that you kind of have as the outstanding. So it's important to kind of recognize those differences sometimes.
Yeah, I'm going to give the classic lawyer answer and just say it depends. You know, it really depends on your sentence. It depends on what type of conviction you have on your record that you were, serving time for in the first place. But I guess I should have led with this here. I am an attorney, but I am none of the things I say today constitute legal advice. So I'll be talking a lot about the local DC supervision experience. But if you are a person experiencing community supervision, you should always consult a lawyer, an attorney who's handling your case if you have one, to discuss case specifics.
Makes sense. And on the flip side of that, I am not a lawyer, but I am somebody that is currently actually under supervision, so dealing with this kind of very directly, and so being able to kind of speak from it from that angle in terms of on the ground, dealing with this kind of on a everyday basis, and through the job seeing other people that are kind of navigating it through, so coming at it from that angle on things. And so here in D.C., speaking from that kind of D.C.'s perspective, one of the unique differences for those that are outside of the D.C. area and might not realize this is because we're not a state, everybody under D.C. code violations, they're being supervised by the Court Services and Offenders Supervision Agency called CSOSA, which is actually a federal agency. So our city violators are being monitored by the federal government for this, and that's kind of a unique thing in D.C. And so it is. It's one of those. Every state is going to have things a little bit different depending on how their situation is set up, and then you have the federal violations that do cross over the whole United States. You have a little bit of a similar feel, but even there, you'll find differences in how the supervision offices actually work because you've got different precedent and law put down from the different circuits that kind of manage that. You have different people running some of the different probation offices in various regions, and they have different internal policies. So you do get some interesting discrepancies across the United States based on where you are, what state you're in, as to what supervision looks like.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And I think it's also very highlighted here in DC as well because we have so much overlap with our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia. Mm-hmm. So there are probably, I can say from experience, there are a lot of people who may have active cases that are both in DC and Virginia, or DC and Maryland, or Maryland and Virginia. Mm-hmm. And they might be serving sentences for both jurisdictions or multiple jurisdictions at once. And because of those differences, because of the differences between how people are supervised from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, something that's a violation in one place may not be a violation in another. So it's a complicated problem, and I think it highlights one of the reasons that statehood is an equality issue for our DC residents.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that does a pretty good job kind of given that overview of what it really is we're talking about here.
So once someone is on supervision, right, guys, Mary and Mr. Ragone, mm-hmm. What does that actually look like, right? Can you kind of talk about what kind of rules or conditions do they have to follow, right?
You want to start on this one?
Absolutely, and you should complement it with any of your own personal experiences as well, mm-hmm. But in general, and I'm going to give that classic lawyer answer again, it depends. It depends what jurisdiction you're serving your supervision in. But I can speak about, DC. We often talk about supervision in terms of years. When we're talking about supervised release, that's actually determined by statute. And I'm not going to get into the kind of legalese boring part of the statute, but it really is dependent on the sentence that you are serving prior to supervised release, mm-hmm. and what that charge, like what the maximum amount of time you might have been able to be sentenced to, mm-hmm. that will determine how long you will be on supervised release. Yeah. And then there's actually even the potential for a lifetime supervised release or parole for people who are convicted of crimes that require registration on a sex offender registry. Mm-hmm. So that you could be looking at up to a lifetime of being on supervision. Yep. But as for conditions, that's also going to vary, by place to place. CSOSA has multiple different types of restrictions that are placed that, Virginia or Maryland does not have, and vice versa. But a lot of the most common ones are going to be, you absolutely need to be checking in with mm-hmm. your they call them community supervision officers here, or CSOs. And that can be weekly or multiple times a week. And, failure to attend one of those or without notifying your CSO can result in a violation. There's also a lot of restrictions that might not be something people would expect, mm-hmm. like the use of alcohol to the extent that it interferes with your daily life can be considered a violation. Mm-hmm. And that's something that in any other circumstance would be totally legal. Maybe not wise, but absolutely legal. So it is interesting, the conflict that we see there between what life is like when you are under supervision versus when you are not.
Well, and an interesting note on that, too, especially here in D.C., where we've got kind of interesting things going on as it relates to the criminalization of marijuana usage and things like that, where it's still illegal on a federal level, but in the city, it's a little bit more of a little different in terms of that. But because we're functioning under federal supervision, even that can come in. So you can, and this goes on the federal level. Let's say you're in Colorado or other places where it's legally allowed locally to use marijuana, but if you're on federal probation or federal supervision, it's now potentially a violation. So again, similar to the drinking, you might be doing something that's 100% legal, that short of being on supervision, it would have no problem. But then all of a sudden now, this is an issue. I know some of the other things that, again, it varies location to location, case to case, but some common things are in terms of the check-ins, drug testing is not very uncommon. Depending on the charge, you can have mandatory classes or mandatory treatment that you need to be attending. Let's say you went in for some sort of drug-related offense, or you had some history of abusing drugs, you might be having to go to some sort of drug treatment program on supervision, and that is a requirement for you. Or if I've seen instances in some states where if you're in for a domestic violence or something, you might have to take some sort of anger management class. So it's one of those instances you could have required courses that you're going to need to be taking, or required treatment that you have to go to. A lot of times you have to be actively employed or looking for a job, which really creates this weird barrier with that last thing I just told you about, because what happens when those two instances conflict? You have a job and your boss is wanting you at that job and is planning things around that, but then you also have classes or appointments you have to get to and be able to attend. And what happens if they only have time available during your work hours? Are you now having to manage that, and what becomes how do you balance that? And ultimately, from the supervision office, it's typically, well, you need to do both. And how can you kind of juggle that? And that creates a lot of the stress and the issues with supervision, as you're trying to manage all the different requirements you have that sometimes directly combat each other. Curfews aren't too uncommon across the country. Even in extreme circumstances, you can see electronic monitoring, and there's been places where not only might you be on electronic monitoring, but you're paying for the electronic monitoring during it. So it's adding that extra kind of cost on it. So it becomes this real tricky notion of having to jump through the hoops, especially like Mary was talking about, in terms of these things that are short. If you were not on supervision, would have no problem with you doing it, but now all of a sudden you've got to be figuring out how to navigate that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the term that I use to think about it is we're looking at a cycle of harm where, you're serving your time on supervision, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you get that job, but your boss is a little bit strict about your arrival and your presence at all times. They're okay hiring you given that you've maybe disclosed your status having to make these appointments, but they really need you there. Okay, so what do? Do you risk losing your job, which could be a violation of your supervision? What do you tell your CSO? I think there's also this added point of, there's like a personal violation of privacy as well, because there are jurisdictions that have restrictions on like who you can live with, who you can be friends with,
Absolutely.
where you can live. We look at the possibility of having a condition that you can't live in a certain area because that area is known for having high rates of drug use or drug purchase or sale. And, that's entire neighborhoods where somebody's family might live, like there are things that we just can't control. And the truth is, having connections with your family and the people that you love and who love you, that's adding to rehabilitation. And so there are situations where these conditions that might restrict your actual relationships could make the likeliness of going back to jail higher. When we look at the ways that probation or supervision, it's meant to be a rehabilitative process. And yet there are conditions that prevent you from doing that because of putting strains on your interpersonal relationships or putting a strain on your ability to be employed.
No, absolutely. I mean, look at DC. I think when I was giving testimony earlier this week, I found a number that said that there's an estimated about close to 10% of the population in DC has a conviction record. And so you're looking at 1 in 10. Well, a lot of instances when you're coming out and you're going on to supervision, one of the requirements is you're not supposed to have any contact or interaction with someone that has a prior conviction. Well, when you're looking at a city where 1 in 10 people might have that, that becomes a lot more difficult, especially when you start getting into some of these neighborhoods that have been disproportionately affected by that, where those numbers skew even farther up. We're telling them they need to go back into their communities and get that community support and that help. But so often you look at some of the different people in the reentry field, many of them have criminal records themselves. Like it's one of those, they've gone through the process, they understand it, they come out and they want to help. But now you're having to go to your officer to find out, can I even interact with these people? Can I see them? If I want to call them later to be able to go out to dinner to talk about their experiences, I've got to worry about this could violate me and send me back to prison. And so it definitely makes that reintegration really difficult. And it's one of those things to where you also have to look in a city like DC in terms of supervision. A number from CSOSA put out that it's nearly 9 out of 10 people on probation or supervision in DC are black. So you can see the kind of the disparate impact that's going on in that kind of situation. One of the neat stories I remember while I was in and going through the Georgetown Prison Scholars Program, they had this guest speaker out from this really neat organization out in, I believe, California called Recidiviz. And they're focused around basically using data to drive improvements in the criminal justice system. But they were telling a story about one state they were working with. And they were noticing when they dug into the revocation numbers that there was a extremely large, disproportionate number of revocations put on to Native American individuals that were under supervision. And they're trying to figure out, why this is happening. And what they found as they dug deeper is they were routinely getting violated because they were missing meetings or missing call-ins that they were supposed to do. Again, at a disproportionately larger number. And so as they started looking in and started talking to people, what they found out was a lot of returning citizens don't necessarily have vehicles. They're relying on public transportation or Uber or things like that. Well, those weren't nearly as readily available on a reservation than it was in the city. So they were having that much more difficult time getting to their meetings. Similarly, cell usage and cell service was not as sound there. They didn't have as many landlines. So the call-ins were getting more difficult. So that population in and of itself, those restrictions that were already onerous for people in kind of the city setting were extremely onerous for them and was causing a greater number of revocations. Now, thankfully, they were able to come in on the back end and start saying, okay, we're going to give kind of additional warnings in these instances, understanding the nature of it. But that kind of shows you how little impacts can have a big ultimate effect. Us here in D.C., so I grew up in southwestern Virginia, a little tiny city compared to D.C. or any of your bigger ones. And I've been amazed by the public transportation system in D.C. because the notion of being able to use a bus or let alone a metro system to get anywhere was foreign to me growing up. And so it's one of those things to where, like, right now, yeah, if you're in D.C. and you need to get somewhere, the bus system might not be great, but it's there. But imagine being some other places in the country where you might be living 30 minutes outside of the city. There is no necessarily easy public transportation. You've got to get to your probation office to speak with a person at a given point. That can be a massive barrier and difficulty. And then that stress of realizing, hey, if I miss this, if I'm 5 minutes late, this could be the difference between me going back to jail or not.
Yeah, and there's the added barrier of if you've been in prison for, multiple years or even less, but you just didn't have one before you went in, how are you going to get a driver's license? How are you going to get to that appointment if you can't drive yourself legally from point A to point B? You might have to rely on people you know. Okay, well, what if, your brother who has a truck to take you to that appointment, what if he's a felon? What are you going to do? Like, we're creating these situations that are putting undue amounts of stress on people who are already coming from one of the most stressful environments that we have in this country, which is the prison system. We are creating a feedback loop of you get released, you are saddled with some really intense restrictions on your movement, on who you are friends with, who you spend time with, where you live, and you are being set up to fail because it is so difficult to meet the expectations that are being placed upon you. And so when we look at probation as a rehabilitative system, or just community supervision in general as a rehabilitative system, we have to ask ourselves if it's really accomplishing that, if it's operating this way. And, I can say based on my own experience in DC, it's operating that way. It's having people set up to fail. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of people across the country in different jurisdictions that would likely agree with that.
Yeah, no, you're right. I remember when I had my first meeting with them, it's one of those, they tried to stress that, this isn't supposed to be more punishment. This is supposed to be helping you transition back into the community and get you back on your feet. And we're here to help make sure you do it in a safe and sound way. But we're not supposed to be, we're not here to give you more punishment. And that's great to say, but in the practice of it definitely at times feels like it can be more punitive potentially than it is necessarily rehabilitative and truly aimed at doing what's best to get you reintegrated back into society.
I'm also going to make a brief correction. What I should say is, what do you do if someone that you love has a felony record? We're going to use people language first. And so I'm going to avoid the use of the word felon because it's not helpful. It's only conducting harm rather than help.
Yeah, so where do we go from here? Let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about the cost associated with some of the things that we're discussing. And what I'm kind of getting you guys to give us some feedback on is, what kind of financial or personal costs do these systems carry for the individuals under supervision, for the public as well? I don't know who wants to start, but yeah, it's a good segue. Well,
I think Mary was hitting on something even with the last thing we were just talking about. So think about the notion of transportation or housing or getting back onto your feet,
hidden
and
costs.
The hidden costs of that, to where let's say you don't have ways of getting around. You've got to figure out how to pay for that transportation. If you're not in a city that has a lot of public transportation, are you getting Ubers constantly? Are you in the social cost of imposing on the little bit of a network you might still have, having to ask them, can you take me to this? Can you take me to here? I mean, that's one aspect of the personal costs.
There's also a very real financial cost that comes from just the burden of, a lot of jurisdictions, 47 in total, impose fees on community supervision, and most of those 47 jurisdictions will sanction community supervisees who are failing to pay costs. So what we're looking at is, again, like criminalization of poverty, basically, is you're leaving prison, or maybe you've been sentenced straight to probation, but you're not making enough money to cover both, rent, food for the family, kids' school fees, things like that. And now you've also got to pay for your own supervision. What is going to give? If you can't pay your costs, are you going to accept going back to prison potentially, and then, losing another additional income for your family? It's about like a balancing act about what you may or may not have to choose between. And in general, the costs can be high.
Yeah.
It really, again, varies state to state, but you're going to hear me say it depends so many times on this recording, but it does depend where you live and what the state imposes in terms of fees. I got this information from the Fines and Fees Justice Center. So
Good organization.
Yeah, great data collecting org. And if you're curious about your own jurisdiction, you should take a look at their website and find out more. But the range is from tens of dollars per month to hundreds of dollars per month. You're looking at potentially another rent payment, basically. And that's the kind of thing that can set somebody back, significantly. You may have to choose between groceries or paying your supervision fees that month. And that's just not a choice, I think, anyone expects to ever have to make.
Yep. And in terms of, like, we were speaking about some of the potential requirements of supervision. If you're lucky, maybe that the supervision office is going to be paying for those, but sometimes not. Those additional classes or treatment that you have to undertake, you might have to be paying out of pocket for that yourself. The electronic monitoring, a lot of times they're charging you to basically pay to be monitored. So that's that. And then you also have the hidden costs that are with that. Like it could be one of those, let's say you have an appointment that you have to go to, once a week that needs you to leave your work at 3:00 instead of 5. Well, now all of a sudden 2 hours a week, you're losing out on time that you would be working. You're losing out on that part of your paycheck every week because of the appointment you have to go to. And so that's kind of that stealth cost as well, where it's pulling you down. But then we're talking about the cost on the individual, but there's also a level of cost on the taxpayer when it comes to this, because I know a lot of times we look at the idea that supervision is less expensive than prison. That's been one of those things that they've used to try to push for, say, with the First Step Act and trying to get more people put into community supervision and home release than in prison. And that is true. But that doesn't mean that supervision is cheap or for the taxpayer. It's still one of those things to where looking at data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and from USA Jobs, it's one of those things to where, on average, across the nation, supervisory officers typically have about 50 to 100 people underneath of them, and the average salaries for a federal one is $60,000 to $80,000. So you're looking, like in D.C., it's estimated a little over 10,000 people are on some sort of supervision. That's looking at $9.7 million a year just in salary costs in order to largely just monitor people. So it's one of those, it's a significant burden on the taxpayer as well. And especially when you get to, I'm sure we're going to be talking later about the amount of people that go in for technical violations, but the amount of people that cycle back into prison afterwards because we're holding them on supervision longer than is necessary or beneficial, or for reasons that have nothing to do with a new charge, you're actually just funneling it back into the more expensive prison system over and over again. So there's a good cost to the taxpayer on having supervision that is not effective in what it does.
That's absolutely right. And I'd recommend anyone listening, if you're curious about specific numbers in specific states, Pew Charitable Trusts has done a lot of reporting on this topic, on what the actual cost of supervision looks like state to state. And they've also done analyses of what different reforms can save in terms of money without actually threatening public safety in any way.
Wow. Okay, so unfortunately, violations happen, right? You too. And so what does the process look like when someone is accused of violating their supervision? And let's go a little bit deeper in terms of, like, what are the consequences? Mary, want to start it off?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to reiterate again that this does not constitute legal advice, but in DC, the process begins with something called an alleged violation report. That's prepared by the community supervision officer. In other jurisdictions, you might call this person your PO or your CSO. And that report is prepared by the supervision officer and then filed, and that usually results in a hearing in the court. And consequences can range. There might be more stricter conditions placed upon your probation or your supervision, but you might also be stepped back, which is the term for being reincarcerated for violating. Or you might have your probation or your supervision completely revoked, in which case you are going back to prison.
Yep.
So there are some very serious consequences, and it ranges in terms of the severity of what the CSO believes or the severity of the violation is.
Yep. And it's one of those things too, in terms of those revocations and potentially going back to prison. There a case that's gotten a lot of media attention out of Pennsylvania, I believe was a federal case with Meek Mill. It's one of those situations that not only then can they revoke you and send you back to prison, but they can actually also add time to your supervision. And so it just becomes this ongoing cycle where you're back to prison for a short time, you get back out, but you now have more supervision time, which is just more time that you can potentially get into issues. And I think that's the other big thing, because I think Mary did a great job in terms of the process. But one of the big things that really stands out, like in D.C., based on CSOSA numbers from fiscal year 2023, almost 9% of supervisees were revoked back to incarceration. But of those, only around 2% were because of new crimes, like actually going out and committing a new crime. The vast majority of them, almost 3 times that amount, was because of these technical violations, because they missed a meeting, because they didn't check in at the proper time, because they so one of the requirements we didn't talk about, but let's say you want to visit, you're living in DC but you have family in Baltimore and you want to visit them. If you didn't check with your probation officer or supervision officer and get permission before that, that's a possible revocation. And it becomes one of those things to where they could just tell you, no, you can't go visit your family. But so there's a lot of, most of the people going back to prison, you would think that, oh, they're committing more crimes, but it's not. Typically, they're just failing to do little parts of their supervision, or sometimes, like we talked about with the alcohol, doing something perfectly legal and that hundreds of thousands of people do every day. But because they're on supervision, all of a sudden now that's a reason to go back to jail.
Yeah, I agree. I think we see, technical violations are such a driver of reincarceration across the country, and a driver of costs because of what you mentioned, that loop of you go back to prison and then you're once again put back on supervision in this constant cycle. And it makes sense that when you speak with people who are incarcerated, there are folks who will say, I'd rather just finish my time in prison than have to deal with any community supervision time. Because there are situations where, like, for example, a parole scheme, if you're able to get out early, you're going straight to supervision, not just to freedom. You're going to still have the government watching your every move and restricting your, perfectly legal actions. So I think it stands to reason. Of course, people would prefer to just serve their straight time and then be released back to their families and return to their communities fully. Instead, we have this system that's like this new kind of prison where you are in the community, but you are not of the community. You do not have the same freedoms that your neighbors have. Instead, you are still policed in a way that makes it more likely, the longer you are on supervision, the more likely you will eventually have to return to prison.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of those things I've jokingly had to explain to, say, my family, my parents, that, the way I have to look at it right now is, I get it. They're like, oh, you're free, but in a lot of ways, I'm just now I'm in a super camp. I'm in a super low security prison. It's one of those. There's might not be the giant walls up, but I do still have a fence. It's 50 miles around DC. It's one of those. It's much better than the fence that I was in while I was incarcerated, but it's still there, and it's still that realization that, hey, step one foot outside of that fence, and that's possible. That's a new charge of sorts. So it's definitely, you have to kind of have that mindset. And you have to, it creates a level of stress, because if you slip from that mindset, especially when you have these longer time, like in the federal system, it's typically 1 to 5 years, with the exceptions being that there are some instances that you can get 10, 15, even, like we said, lifetime supervision periods, to where the longer it goes on, if you let yourself start getting a little bit comfortable and feeling like, oh, I'm just a normal person functioning in normal society, it makes it that much easier to slip up. And that's the problem with some of these long supervision times. Like the Council of State Governments did a study and found that, longer supervision terms don't actually reduce recidivism to any significant degree. Most rearrests happen in the first year, but we have instances where you're having people with 3, 5, and like we said, even 10, 15 lifetime supervision. That's not necessarily doing anything to help public safety, but it sure is making it to where they're having to either live under that continual stress of knowing at any given point if they screw up, they can go back in, or if they get too comfortable, making it that much more likely that they miss a meeting, they miss a check-in, they take a trip with some friends without thinking about the fact that, oh, wow, it was 10 miles outside of my radius where I was supposed to go. So it's definitely one of those issues where the length of it really can have a big impact on the person, with very little impact on public safety and the actual purposes of doing these type of supervision.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that reflected here in DC as well. Courtesy of Prison Policy Initiative, they did a study on the DC jail residents. 1 in 7 people in the DC jail are there for a violation of their conditions of community supervision. But of that 1 in 7, 35% are there for technical violations.
Mm-hmm.
So just a brief definition here of a technical, what we're talking about is something non-criminal and non-violent. Because something criminal or violent is not that's going to be a much more serious, that's going to be a new charge, you know, that's not the same thing. So we have this huge number of people sitting in DC jail for essentially, missing an appointment or maybe just waiting to have a hearing based on the alleged violation report that they got for failing to disclose a parking ticket to their CSO. We have, and that not only is the psychological cost of that incarceration so high for the person who is, subject to it, but the actual financial cost of incarceration that has no bearing on public safety, because believe it or not, the community is not made less